You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Friday, March 8th, 2019. It is also the first Friday of Lent and the feast day of St. John of God. This week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we have been talking about our transition from ordinary time into the Lenten season. We discussed Mardi Gras, Ash Wednesday, and we have been talking about some important saints that really help us understand what Lent is all about. And today we are going to continue talking about those saints with today's saint, St. John of God. Now, perhaps St. John of God isn't quite as familiar to you as some of the saints that we talk about, but that's totally fine. We have so many saints in our Catholic tradition that we can always find another one to learn about. So, St. John of God lived in the 1500s in Spain, a long time ago. Life was very different for him than it is for us. He was born to a family that had been wealthy, but when he was born around that time, they were impoverished. Now, although the details of his early life are a little hard to figure out, we know that St. John of God either ran away from home when he was very young or was taken and kidnapped from home. The grief from losing her son led to his mother's early death. And thinking his son was lost, his father joined a Franciscan order, leaving St. John of God an orphan as a small child. He was forced to beg and eat whatever food he could find. Finally, he settled on being a shepherd. After that, he joined the military and was part of the military or working as a shepherd for the early years of his life. In fact, all the way up until he was 42 years old. He sort of lived this normal life with all the normal sins and temptations of anyone of his time. However, when he was 42 on the feast of Saint Sebastian, he experienced a tremendous conversion. He heard a homily that called everyone to think more about the needs of others than their own needs. And for some reason, this message really It really called St. John of God to an extreme conversion. When he began to look at his life and see all the ways that he had failed, he endured a lot of self-given penances. He fasted, he beat himself, he did all sorts of things because he felt so guilty about the life that he had lived. However, a couple key spiritual mentors and even a vision from Mary herself encouraged St. John of God to no longer take this out as penance upon himself, but to instead change his focus from himself to those in need. Now, St. John of God took this message to heart very strongly. He became one of the greatest examples of loving our neighbor that has ever walked this earth. In fact, some people think that we call him St. John of God because he demonstrated the type of love that God wants us to show to our brothers and sisters here on earth. In fact, St. John of God had a habit where if he would walk through a city, he would trade his cloak with whatever beggar passed his way. So if he was walking, he would give his new coat to a beggar. And then if he came to a beggar who had an even worse coat than the first beggar, he would change his cloak again and again until he was in the most tattered rags imaginable. He spent his life tending to the sick and being moved with pity for the poor. Now, what does this have to do with Lent? Well, my friends, Lent is not only about making resolutions and becoming a better version of ourselves. Of course, all those things are true. Lent is about breaking ties with our selfish behavior. All too often, we spend time thinking about ourselves, what we need, what we want, what we desire, and we spend very little time thinking about other people. But St. John of God demonstrates to us that when we see someone that is hungry, when we see injustice done to another person, we should feel sorrow. We should feel the sorrow of God. Now, the sorrow of God is not just a feeling, it is a feeling that leads to action. Just like St. John of God, when he saw a beggar with a poor, tattered cloak, he immediately acted. He took his cloak off and took the more tattered cloak. He was motivated by love that was sad, that was moved to pity when he saw the suffering of another human being. That is what we are striving for through Lent. Striving to stop looking at ourselves so much, to start looking outward and to do something. Remember, the third pillar of Lent is to give alms. Do you have more than you need? Can you give some of your weekly allowance to the poor? Can you give more? Can you stop thinking about what you need and want and think about others? These are all things that adults and children need to be thinking about more during the Lenten season. And so, Sprouts, I have a challenge for you today. It is simple. I simply want you to think about St. John of God and picture him in this horribly tattered cloak. But picture him with a smile on his face, because he knows that he is living in the love of God. And I want you to say this simple prayer. St. John of God, pray for me that I might love others with the love of God.
That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God intended you to be. One final word to the grown-ups. Thank you so much for listening to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. I would like to invite you to join a special Facebook group just for those that listen to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. We will use this group to connect, to share resources around that week's theme, and simply celebrate raising future saints. To find the direct link to the Facebook group, simply check the notes for this podcast episode.